Hello, everyone. Hi, I'm Wendy Wasserman from Politics and Prose. I'm here with Putsata Reang, and we are actually having a little bit of technical difficulties. So if you could just hold on tight and don't go anywhere, because we are kind of trying to figure this out to be able to welcome our co-host. So I'm going to be on mute for a few minutes while we try to sort this out, but don't go anywhere. I see all 17 of you there, so hold tight. Hi all, I'm Wendy Wasserman from Politics and Prose. If you're here for PMP Presents with Putsata Reang, you're in the right place. We're just having a little bit of technical difficulties. So just hang tight, and we will be back with you in just a second. Okay, hi, I'm Wendy Wasserman, and I'm with Politics and Prose, and you are here for a chat with Putsata Reang. We are having a little bit of difficulties with our host, our co-host Charles Yu, which is really a bummer because I was hoping he would join us, but we can't figure out how to make it work. So just bear with us. We have a few more things we have to do here, and we're going to take care of all of that.
Yay. Yeah.
It worked.
Terrific. so sorry. I don't know what's happening.
Yay! I was starting to think that, Zoom had COVID or something.
Yeah, so
So
strange.
thank you to the 20 of you who stuck through all that. Hopefully, as we get past COVID, our Zoom skills will, I don't know, there'll be some like crossing of the Zoom skills or something. But I'm Wendy Wasserman. I'm here, delighted to be here on behalf of Politics and Prose with Putsata Reang and Charles Yu. We're excited, super excited for Putsata's new book. It came out perfectly this week, just in time for Asian American Heritage Month, which was super terrific. I sat down and started reading it the other day and got literally drank through half of it in one sitting. So I think you all will really enjoy it. Please buy it. And we will have a link in the chat through this conversation. So before we get going, I just want to do some real quick housekeeping. This is one thing that just happened with Charles is you will know that if you have a link that we can't see you. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box. That's where Charles will take a look at them later in the conversation. So what'll happen is Putsata and Charles will have a brief chat, and that'll go on for a good half hour or so, and then they'll take questions from you. So let me just introduce who we're looking at and talking to today. So Putsata Reang is an author and a journalist whose writings have appeared in the New York Times, in Politico, in The Guardian, in Ms., and in the Seattle Times. She's actually just outside of Seattle today. And she was born in Cambodia, which is what the book is about, and raised in rural Oregon. And she's also lived and worked in more than a dozen countries, including Cambodia, Afghanistan, and Thailand. And she is an alum of residencies at Hedgebrook, Kimmel Harding Nelson, and Mineral School. And she's received fellowships from the Alicia Patterson Foundation and the Jack Straw Writers Program. She teaches memoir writing at the University of Washington School of Professional and Continuing Education. And Charles here is the author of 4 books, including his latest, Interior Chinatown, which won the 2020 National Book Award for Fiction. His fiction and nonfiction has appeared in publications including The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, and Wired, among others. And also with TaiwaneseAmerican.org, he has sponsored the Betty L. and Jin CU Creative Writing Prizes for students. So that's enough from me. I am gonna disappear. And when we get close to about 7 o'clock Eastern, you might see me pop up again. All right, take it away, people.
Hi, Putsata. Hi,
Charles. What an incredible honor to be here. I'm so thrilled to be sharing this space with you. Been such a fan of yours, and made all the more true when my wife and I saw you in Seattle, and just so many central insights and takeaways from your latest beautiful novel, Interior Chinatown. And congrats, by the way, on National Book Award. We saw that.
Thank you. Thanks. Oh, thanks. Well, congratulations on your book. And it is harrowing and beautiful, and at times, honestly, difficult to read, but in the way that, I go to reading for, in that it really felt like it was so many things. So we're going to talk about it. I won't try to give you a real-time blurb here, but it's a wonderful book. And thanks for everyone who persevered. I apologize that this is getting started late. It will come at the expense of my questions, which I think I sent you way too many questions anyway. So I'll get to as many as I can, and then promise to leave time for the Q&A, which I think is always, to my mind, the better part anyway. And I'm also seeing that my lunch bowl is behind me, which is very embarrassing. I'm going to remove that. You'd think that 2 years in, I would be better at Zoom, but I am not. For people,
Charles, mine is just off to the side right here.
But see, that's the key. That's exactly anything out of frame is fine. Well, people probably wouldn't know yet, since I'm assuming. So one, I'll try not to spoil things unless you want to. I'll defer to you. And I also, if you wanted to set it up at all, or give a brief reading, obviously if you'd like to do that now or at any point. Yeah, maybe if you could just start by telling us a little bit about the book, that'd be great.
Yeah, this book, it really explores this theme of debt and duty and tries to get to the heart of the question of what do we owe our mothers who gave us life? But there's an added complexity and an added dimension in my particular story, which is what do I owe the woman who not only gave me life, but the woman who saved my life? This goes back to when my family fled Cambodia in 1975, the Khmer Rouge communist regime had just taken over. And my family at the time lived on the southern coast of Cambodia. So we got lucky. And by virtue of the fact that we were there on the coast, we had an exit out. Our family spent 23 days at sea, and I was 11 months old. And about halfway into that journey, I grew to be very sick. And the captain of the ship thought that I had died. So he had asked my mother, worried that a dead baby's corpse would contaminate an overcrowded vessel filled with more than 300 refugees. He asked my mother to throw me overboard. And my mother, as a mother would do, refused. When I asked her later about it, she said she had a little bit of hope that I was still alive. But it was that moment and my own origin story that sort of planted the seed and this question of, what do I owe my mother? So indeed, I spent my entire life feeling that I owed her my life, and thus the thrust of the book and the narrative arc of the book really sends us down that journey until the end of the book, where things start to shift a little bit. You're still muted, Charles. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Even having read it, hearing you describe it is a whole other level. And you at one point, I think you described your family had to live like basically underneath a machine gun. Is that right? For a while, right?
Yeah, for 23 days. My mom sort of found this spot, one spot, which was enough for our family to sit together. She said we took turns lying down to sleep. And we stayed there. What was great about that was that we actually had something, my father had something to tie gramas, which are Cambodia's ubiquitous scarves. He used the turret of the gun to tie gramas to at least give us a little bit of shade there, as opposed to others who had no shade at all. And my mom still, when I asked her stories about what those 23 days were like, one of the things that she said, and she spoke so clearly in such detail about it, was leaning her back against the metal mounting of that machine gun, and that was sort of like her backrest during those days.
I mean, it's hard to sort of fathom that in terms of the amount of physical suffering, but probably on top of that, the mental and emotional anguish, I imagine, of the stress of trying to keep a young baby alive, and during a time like that. What you write in a line that really stuck with me, that you don't have like actual, like, I guess, explicit memories, but that your body knows that you carry that still with you.
Right, I do. I've always felt that my body holds all those memories from those days, even though my mind doesn't have any visual cues to what those 23 days were like. And this idea that our bodies and our muscles do have memory. They hold on to things and experiences that happen to us. And in my particular case, it was the feel of the rocking back and forth, both from the waves being on the boat, but also my mother cradling me and rocking me and praying and hoping that I was still alive and that I would make it to whatever destination we were going to. And there in the middle of the sea, there was no destination. The only plan was leave Cambodia. The only plan was escape, get out. But there was no destination in mind.
And then your family made it to a destination, and I think your first, maybe not be your first home, but your first sort of like semi-permanent home was in Corvallis. Is that right?
Yep, we landed in Corvallis, Oregon, pretty deep inland in what's called the Willamette Valley, which is Oregon's sort of agricultural belt, filled with fertile fields, all sorts of farms. One of the things that I find beautiful about the fact that we ended up in Corvallis is because my family came from an agricultural background. A lot of relatives on both my mother and my father's side are rice farmers in Cambodia. And so they were really used to these very bucolic settings, full of fields. And so when we arrived in Corvallis, there was just this absolute serenity, this peace and calm and stillness that was there.
Mm.
And when I think about that, I think how lucky we were to have ended up, of all places, in a small town in Oregon that almost mimicked the kind of feeling of the environment that my parents had experienced back in Cambodia, to be thrust from our country in such a violent way vis-a-vis the war, but then to end up in a place of peace. I think, to me anyways, I think it couldn't have been a better outcome for my family.
And there are, in addition to there being very sort of harrowing passages to read, there's also a lot of passages that are beautiful and describe a kind of communal family life, including some of your extended family that ends up arriving. And I want to get to that, but can I back up just for a second, maybe a little bit? Early on, you describe your mother's upbringing in Cambodia, and you write that being college educated and unmarried at age 22 made my mother an anomaly twice over in rural Cambodia. And I also wanted to sort of combine this with another question: is you started this project in 2011, I think, triggered by a family event, basically, and then the process was basically talking to your mom, right? If I understand. Can you talk about what that was like in terms of like your complicated relationship with your mom, or what it was like to ask your mom and hear maybe some of these stories in this new context, I guess?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And it's what I do like to talk about, because I came to this book from a background as purely a journalist, telling other people's stories, and suddenly found myself turning the questions on myself and my mother, the both of us. I probably interviewed her as much as I interviewed myself for this book. And, I often think if it weren't for the fact that my father ended up having heart issues and had a quadruple bypass surgery, I was living in Cambodia at the time, in Phnom Penh, working with journalists in a training program to sort of help build international standards of journalistic skills with Khmer journalists. And when my mother called me to tell me my father was in the emergency room, this was 2010, all she got out of her mouth was "your father" before she began to sob. Here they were in Oregon, the place where I grew up. There I was in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, the place where all of us are from. And 7,500 miles separated me from a moment that could have gone in a very different direction. I knew what I knew. My father had either died or was going to die. And so I did get on the plane and I went there. And the fortunate piece of this is that my father did not die. But then there was another fortunate piece, which is that by virtue of my father getting so close to his own mortality, my parents, for the very first time, were not only willing, but eager to tell me some of their stories, because I had asked growing up. I had asked about their past and our lives, and why were we so different from other people in Corvallis? Even though I feel like I grew up American and only knowing that I was American, I always knew I was different. But my parents they didn't want us to focus on the past. They wanted us to, it's a very Buddhist idea, forward thinking. It's a waste of time to go backwards. But I also feel like sometimes you have to go backwards in order to begin to go forward. And so that process of actually formally interviewing my mom I'll have to admit, it was pretty treacherous territory. One thing to interview a stranger, but when the person, your primary source is your mother, there's just no way to prepare yourself to hear what she's going to say. Whether they are funny stories or whether they are heartbreaking stories. And one of the things that was so difficult about interviewing my mother was that because this was the first time she was telling stories specifically about her life before the war, our lives when we escaped the war, and then those early years in Corvallis, she was being re-triggered through that. And there were so many times where she would say, I'm tired of remembering. And she would go upstairs into her bedroom and I would hear her cry. And I felt so sick to my stomach thinking, I've just opened up these old wounds for my mother. And is it going to be worth it in the end to do this to her? But she kept wanting to tell me stories. And to the extent that she wanted to tell me stories, I thought, let me put them down. Let me get this down. Because one other thing she said over the course of about 4 years of interviewing her, 3 or 4 years of interviewing her formally, was I don't know what's going to happen to these stories I told you and your sisters and brothers. When I'm dead, the story ends. And one of the big motivations for me to write this book is that I don't want her stories to end. I don't want my story to end and my family's history to end. We have to get these stories down.
Yes, I think that's the activity of capturing that is so layered to think about. In my thinking anyway, families are kind of a story, like a collaborative activity of like, how do we think of ourselves? How do we mythologize or misremember or accurately remember, and so this kind of narrative, like what is our family? And then to actually, as a journalist, and then your relationship with your mother, which had so much to it, it just feels like it must have been I don't know, I'm thinking exhausting, but also cathartic or just I don't know.
It was both cathartic, it was surprising, it was exciting. I remember sometimes she would tell me things and immediately I would email or call one of my sisters and tell her, you will not believe what mom just told me. Just like, get so excited just actually, in fact, how the book opens with my mom running away when she learns that she is going to be corralled into an arranged marriage. And because of the fact that she, as you mentioned, Charles, she growing up in Cambodia, she was an anomaly. To be from rural Cambodia and have an education was fairly rare back then. And she had a benevolent uncle who took her and another younger sister to raise them because my maternal grandmother had too many children in the village. And because of that one act, she got an education, but that also meant that she could think for herself. And she also had something that many Khmer girls are not ever born to have, which are dreams. And she wanted to be a businesswoman. She didn't want to get married and raise kids, have a husband. And yet she couldn't escape her culture. And, I think that this theme of not being able to escape one's culture, well, first of all, trying to figure out what one's culture is, especially for people like me who were born in another country and grew up in America. Which culture do we owe fidelity to? Which culture do we want to align ourselves with and accept? And which parts of our cultures do we reject? And so, my mom, in so many ways, when she made that decision to run away rather than get married to my father, which she eventually did, it was a pretty rebellious act. And when I think about that one single act in her life, I've always thought my mom and I were so different. And my editor over various drafts of this book kept telling me, you're always telling me how different you and your mom are, but in fact, you guys are actually pretty similar. And I won't give anything away, but I would have my own rebellious act later in the book.
Yeah, and I think we can definitely get to that, or I don't know if you want to preserve it, but I kind of wanted to, before we sort of move on, ask you one more question sort of in that vein is, you write about both your mother, who, as you mentioned, had the good fortune of being sort of raised for a while by her uncle. And so therefore kind of having a different upbringing than most of her siblings, right? She and one other of her sisters got to sort of get an education. And it seems like I think your maternal grandmother also it seems like an extremely resourceful person. It's, someone who was able to feed and clothe children in really challenging circumstances. And at the same time, you write about it, the day a Khmer girl is born is the day she comes into debt, as you sort of led off with. And then you are mostly raised, in the US, right, in a very different time in society. And I don't know if you could talk a little bit about sort of, the women in your family and more generally about being a girl or woman in Khmer society.
Absolutely. I have to give a lot of kudos to my mother for doing the absolute best she could to raise such strong daughters here in America, but at the same time also raise us with a sense of a deep respect and attachment to our own culture. It's hard to do. It's sometimes hard to hold both things at the same time, honoring one's culture while also embracing this new life, this new American life. And indeed, that's one of the key dilemmas of this this memoir. My mom raised my sisters and I in this container of this message that when you grow up, you're going to have a husband and you have to have a hot meal ready for him. That's what we all heard growing up. And at the same time, as she would tell us that, she would tell us, get an education, because when you can get an education, it's what her uncle told her. She told us, when you get an education, you don't have to do these backbreaking jobs like me and your dad. At the time, she was a janitor, and my father was washing dishes at a local diner in downtown Corvallis. And of course, being parents, immigrant parents, they wanted us to do so much better than where they were when they arrived in Corvallis, as any parent would. And so my mom was also juggling these two very different ways of raising her daughters. On the one hand, to be independent, and then on the other hand, but still keep some of the culture. And those things were just clashing constantly. One of the things I'll never forget, though, is just this feeling of, when I was growing up and beginning to understand my own sexual orientation, she specifically said, when you have a husband. She never said when you have a wife. And so I knew that was not going to be an option for me. And so, by the time I came to a realization that, I'm gay, it was completely disorienting to me. I mean, I knew when I was young, but when I began to let myself accept that about myself, it was a very disorienting feeling.
You jumping around a little bit, but since we talked about you, your sexual orientation and you coming out, I guess, to your mom, but before that, you went and basically, am I right, started sort of your professional life in Seattle in like the 90s and the grunge scene, but also I think that was when you started to date or really explore the dating scene in Seattle in the 90s.
I did, yeah.
Sounded fun.
It was fun, but I have to admit it was pretty awkward. I'm a little bit of a nerd when it comes to going out and dating. I didn't really know how to date, actually. I got thrust into Seattle soon after graduating from the University of Oregon's journalism program, and I had a stint in Spokane, Washington as well, at Spokesman Review, which was fantastic to cut my teeth as a young reporter there. But it was Seattle where I felt I was able to actually be more of who I was, because at the time when I started my job at the Seattle Times, there were a number of us young reporters in our 20s, and we all would just go out together. And it was the very first time that I had met other young people who were gay. And so I came out to one of my very close friends first, Tyrone Beeson, and he took me up to the one lesbian bar in Seattle, sat me down, and basically coached me how to make a move on a woman. I failed so miserably. I felt so embarrassed. I showed up with my, khaki pants and button-down J. Crew shirt and penny loafers, which were already terribly outdated by then. And so it was incredibly embarrassing, but I learned, and every chance I got to just push myself a little further out there to be more of myself, I was able to gain some confidence, and I think I was able to, well, we'll have to ask my wife if I upped my game in the dating realm.
Well, clearly something's working.
Yeah.
But then you ended up coming out to your mother a few years later, I guess, or at some point in your 20s.
Yeah, I came out, I left Seattle and I ended up working at the San Jose Mercury News in the Bay Area. And my gosh, if, our little Capitol Hill gay neighborhood of Seattle blew my mind. The Castro district of San Francisco really was something else for me. I decided that by then I had come out to my siblings, and I let it be known to my siblings that I wanted to be the one to come out to our mom. It was the right thing to do. So I invited her to come down and visit me in the Bay Area. And I was terrified out of my mind. I thought, this is the moment that she'll either reject me or she'll perhaps open her heart a little bit wider and hold me. I wasn't prepared for what happened. When I finally came out to her in my apartment after we had dinner together, I wasn't sure she heard me when I said I'm gay. And so I said it again. And her response was, "Put Matt, love you," which was the very first time she had said those words to me. Because in our culture, love is not something spoken, it's action. It's her cooking for me, it's her doing things for me, and vice versa. We don't say words, "I love you." We show love. And so for her to say that was huge. But then even still, I wasn't sure she understood what gay meant. So I loaded us up into my little Civic, took us across the Bay Bridge, and entered the Castro. And that was her sort of first real on. She,
Cool.
If I was shocked by that, she was even more shocked. But I remember she pressed her cheek to the window at one point, and she was pointing at these two guys holding hands. And she just said, put that the gay? I said, yes, that's the gay. Put your finger down. Don't point. It was terribly embarrassing. But that's when I knew she knows what I'm talking about. She knows who I am. But I will say this last thing, I underestimated what that moment meant. I thought she was accepting me. But in fact, what was happening was that I think for her, as I would later find out, she thought I was just going through a phase. And she continued to believe that up until the point where I told her I was going to get married, and the person I was marrying was a woman.
And that wasn't until quite a few years later, right?
20 years later, right? Yeah.
And do you in that time intervening, it took both time and you continuing to sort of work on her, or how did it progress, I guess?
Right. Those intervening years. So I dated both men and women in those intervening years. And there was a time when I thought that I could have a husband. It would have been so much easier. And I had a couple of very serious relationships. But I also knew in those relationships, as much as I loved previous boyfriends, I knew I was never going to be happy. My parents, I brought home a couple of girlfriends I had dated in those intervening years, but my parents never took it seriously. They always just thought, oh, Puts has her friend, Puts bringing her friend over. And so that was sort of the kind of this veil that was in our family that, we were just not going to talk about it. I think up until the point when I got married, my mom still clung to hope that I was going to be the good Cambodian daughter who brings home not just a husband, but her hope was that I was going to marry a Cambodian man. And so suddenly, not only am I not marrying a man, and then, my wife is not Khmer on top of that, it shattered her heart. And that was the moment that our what I had lived believing was an unbreakable bond actually split.
Mm. You write about how this book was an attempt to build a bridge back to each other. And did you know when you started, and or by the time it was over? Can you talk about how the book and the project may have changed or helped, or your relationship?
Yeah, part of me thinks, one of the things that I've learned from writing memoir is that ultimately those of us that engage in this particular genre, we want the thing that everybody on earth wants, which is to be seen. And that's no different for me and my mother. My hope is that what I've written in these pages will help her understand something deeper about me that perhaps she didn't quite know either, which is that I learned I was so much like her in terms of how she rebelled and ran away rather than get married. I, in fact, did the very same thing, in the sense that I married the person who I wanted to marry because I was in America. Gay marriage was legal. I was in a country and a context where I got to choose, and so I did. And so my greatest hope is that so I'll have to say I'm gonna jump ahead because I saw one of your questions. My parents actually have not read the book.
Okay.
But I did record my own audiobook and plan to support them to listen to it, and help translate that for them as well. And
Wow.
That's a minimum that I can do. And I'm fully prepared to be rejected from the family once again by the time they get to the end of it, but we'll see if that happens or not. My mom's very proud of me. She was at my book launch in Portland a couple days back, and she was just beaming. So I hope that feeling carries through as they're listening to the audio.
Yeah, I love that's exciting, and probably also anxiety inducing, I imagine, on some level.
Really
I love bits about how she would brag about you, and like either inflate or embellish like your salary, which is the best. So maternal.
It feels very classic Khmer also to do that. It's just like, something is always bigger than what it is. And that's why, one of the ideas of or themes that I play with in this book is my mom's version of what a story is versus mine, because mine as a journalist is rooted in facts and figures and truth. And hers is very much, well, if I didn't get the number of your salary right, the spirit of what I was saying is there, which is that you make a lot of money. And for me, it's like, no, you have, like, I don't make $250,000, very far from it. And her point is, it doesn't matter if it's $250,000 or $1 million. I'm just trying to tell my friends that you make a lot of money. It's like, no, Mom, it's not like that.
That's great.
Yeah.
One thing that okay, so now I'm really backing up, because I think we sort of talked about your romantic life and a little bit about your professional life, but I think we sort of jumped over kind of the process of both growing up in Corvallis and what that was like for your family as you found work, or all kind of had work to do to help keep the family, and then started to do really well, right? And actually be able to help other family members.
Right.
What was that like in terms of do you remember those years and
I do.
that experience?
Yeah, and I'll say, that was growing up in Corvallis. My family spent all of our summers picking strawberries and blueberries and raspberries, all the berries, cherry tomatoes, all up and down the Willamette Valley at various farms. I'll say that it was hard work for sure, and it was back in a time when there were no labor laws that barred children from working these long hours, or from working at all, for that matter. And my siblings and I grew up believing that the money we earned in the berry fields, because my parents never let us keep any of it, it sort of went into this family communal fund. And I'd always believed, well, this is, to pay for our food and our home, our cars, things like that. Well, in fact, they weren't. They were, as what happens in many immigrant families, going back to Cambodia as in the form of remunerations for our relatives who had survived the genocide. And I saw that happen for the first time when I went with my mother to Cambodia in 1990. I was 16 years old. And, you know, as I had mentioned earlier, I grew up believing I was American, and suddenly I was landed in a country where everybody looked like me. And it was, I almost feel like it was like a reverse culture shock in a way, because I couldn't speak my own language and I had to depend on my mom to translate for me. And, you know, two things happened on that trip when I was 16 years old. And first of all, I'll say the reason why my mom decided to go in 1990 is that up until that point, for the previous 10 years, my parents had been getting letters in the mail from relatives who had survived the genocide and were making contact with my parents to say, I'm alive, I'm here. And that's when my parents began to find ways to send money back home. By 1990, my mom just thought, I have to go there. I have to go see my relatives who survived. I have to go find others. And I went with her. And so the two things that happened that really changed my life, which should say, one changed my life and one made me think very deeply about this life as a refugee in America, or as an immigrant in America. And the first was that my mom and I went to tour the Dual Slaying Torture Prison in the capital. It's a high school that was turned into a torture prison by the Khmer Rouge, where about 18,000 prisoners were tortured to death. And when we walked through the cells, the museum docent told us 2 journalists were tortured to death here. And I was a student journalist for my high school newspaper at the time. The docent began to tell the story about how the communists targeted journalists so that the story of what was happening wouldn't get out into the world. And it was in that moment that I knew that I was going to be a journalist and that I would never again look away from war. The other thing that happened was that, and that this was a moment of real levity for my mom. We went to my mother's village, where her family's from, and we held a celebration and fed the entire village. You know, there was chicken curry and bread and all sorts of great food. And afterwards, my mom was clutching this leather, this leather bag, and she unzipped it, and there were bricks of cash inside. And she just started handing me bricks of $20 bills and $10 bills and $5 bills, and said, you know, we're handing this out to our relatives. I grew up in Corvallis thinking my family was poor. And suddenly here comes my mom with this bag of bricks of cash telling me to hand it out. And so it was just this moment that I'll never forget, of thinking how strange and how odd and how heartbreaking for both of us that I grew up in Corvallis thinking I was poor. I'm in my own country really seeing poverty. Mm. How do I hold those things together in the same space? And I'll be honest, it's still hard for me to think about that and reckon with that. Mm.
And you were a teenager, I mean, we're 15, 16 at that time.
15 years old, yeah. I arrived in Cambodia with my perm. I had a Sony Walkman. I had Levi blue jeans. couldn't get more American.
Were you tempted to pocket a 20 for yourself?
Oh gosh, I'm not gonna lie, I totally was. I actually, for a minute, I was like, you know what? I just, a little bit of spending cash for all those times we didn't get the money.
Seems fair. Right. So you went, that was your first time back, right? And then you ended up going again in your 20s, and then a third time on a fellowship. Right. For more extent. Well, and so each time it felt like almost like in a, I don't want to say magical way, but it was a kind of time in your life where it had it just hit different, I guess, and was you were a different you as well, right? I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. When I went back in my 20s, it was on the occasion of my grandfather on my mom's side passing away. And we went, again, my mom and I, to do a ceremony in her village to honor him. And back then, you know, in my early 20s, I was a reporter at the Seattle Times, and some of the stories that I wrote while I was at the Seattle Times specifically were related to the Khmer community in Seattle. And suddenly I was confronted with these stories where I was being forced to, not forced to, but I wanted to interview my sources in our language. And so I would call my parents in Corvallis and tell them what my question was, and then they would repeat it to me. And I in Khmer, and I would write that phonetically in my notepad before I would go do these interviews. And so I feel like in my 20s, professionally, I was moving further and further, or I should say not further, closer and closer to my identity and my culture as a Cambodian daughter. And so that trip back in my early 20s to Cambodia really cemented this idea that I want to embrace my culture in a much more meaningful way. By the time I turned 30, and I received an Alicia Patterson Foundation Fellowship as a journalist to go back and do some reporting on landless farmers there. One of the things that I find striking is that when I overlaid my mom's timeline in her life on top of mine, I realized my mother was 30 years old when she held me as a baby, crossing the Pacific Ocean to get to America. And then I was 30 when I crossed back the other way with a notepad and pens as a journalist to go do stories about my own country. And so I felt as if, our lives, the shape of our lives and our narrative was almost like this Mobius strip. And, we were just meant to make these rotations before meeting up at the same place again. And I won't give away the story, but indeed, something along those lines does happen. But it wasn't until I moved to Cambodia when I was 30 that I understood and felt that I wanted to stay, and I did. My sabbatical was for a year from the San Jose Mercury News. And at the end of that year, I called my old boss and I said, I'm not coming back. And I made a commitment, and I stayed in Cambodia for the next decade.
It's you're also something that's of interest to me generally, and on a personal level that I think is fascinating is that the first time you went, you couldn't say much more than hello, and by the third time it was a different situation, and you actually both professionally and personally had a lot of reasons to kind of learn the language that you would have been speaking had you lived there, right?
Right. Yeah, and that language was so critical to me. When my father had his heart attack and I began to interview my parents, my father was very generous in sharing whatever minimal records we had from our family. And one of the things that I uncovered going through some of his papers was he had a single sheet of paper when we arrived in Corvallis. And on that sheet of paper, he had basic words like house and bathroom, and the definitions. He was learning English. The other way around, when I was in Cambodia, I kept a list of words too that I would hear in Khmer, but not know the meaning. And I would keep this list of words. And then in the evenings, I would go to an internet payphone and call my parents and say, I heard this word, what does it mean? And that's how I rebuilt my language in that way. And at some point, I began to dream in Khmer. And when I began to dream in Khmer, there was a time, probably it took about a year, maybe a year and a half, where I was speaking exclusively Khmer while I was in Cambodia. It was an incredible moment for me because then when I would come back to visit my parents in Oregon, I would speak to my mom in Khmer, and then suddenly she was responding to me in English. And I said, wait, no, you're supposed to respond to me in Khmer, because it was a paradigm shift. She couldn't understand why I was speaking Khmer. And so she thought her cue was then she would respond in English, because growing up, it was the opposite. My parents would speak Khmer, and as kids, we'd speak English. So I had to kind of train her to be like, no, I'm speaking in Khmer to you because I actually do speak Khmer now.
I love the reversal. I think it's so fascinating that you made this kind of reverse return, right? As you call it, there's a chapter called The Return, and it really is that, and a kind of seeking. And yet I can see how, from the other perspective, from the parents' perspective who came, it's like, well, we've been here for so long. This is how it's been for so long. And also this is our home. And so I don't know, I don't want to project, but I would also imagine there's a lot of, on some level, pain associated with certain memories. So there's it may be more I just feel like it's coming from such a different place, whereas the American, mostly American born kid or American raised kid is looking for that as a kind of discovery, but that's not discovery from the parental side. I don't know. Now I'm just bloviating, but it's fun to just think. I mean, the way you describe it is just, it's so layered. It's kind of cross directions of that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, you know, those journeys happened when I think back and look at when those journeys back to Cambodia were made. They really were in such pivotal moments of my life, both professionally and personally. And, you know, one of the things that I will say about my mom is, to the extent that she wanted us so badly to maintain our culture, to the degree that her hope for me was to marry a Khmer man. I fell short. I fell short in that one place. However, one of the things that I hope one of the takeaways that I hope my mom will get from this story and from this book is that I did succeed in other ways to be a good Cambodian daughter. And that none of us are going to get this perfect. Trying to be who we are, trying to claim our selfhood. We're going to stumble along the way. We're not going to live up to hopes and expectations, going both ways. You know, I had expected my mom, because she was in America now, to embrace me because I'm gay, and she didn't do that. And so that was devastating for me, because I thought, well, you are in this country now, you see our culture in America is different. You know, why can't you just accept me, is what I was, you know, telling her. But, you know, both of us, you know, we can't cleave ourselves from our cultures and from our histories and from the weight of who we have been in the past.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful book. I think I have time for maybe one question. I've hogged everything, but I don't know how to combine it, because I'm trying to get a 2-for-1 here since we're running out of time. But when do you plan on listening? Or I guess you have to kind of let your parents hear the audio version, and then you'll talk to them about it. / what's your next project? Have you already started to think about what you're working on next?
Yeah, I'm not quite thinking of a next project next. However, people keep planting the seed in my ear about a recipe book of my mom's cooking, and so I think that might be my pace right now, after a pretty intense memoir project. Yeah, you know, we'll see what happens when my parents, you know, kind of how they receive this book. And I think it'll be useful for me to be there, because I stand by what I've written, and at the same time, I understand that there are some hard truths in this book, and I don't think it's fair for my parents to receive this story on their own without me there to talk about why I included some things, why I wrote the book the way that I did.
Yeah, it's a really brave and beautiful book, and I am really grateful to you for writing it, and to just honored to be able to have a chance to talk to you, and thanks to everyone for, you know, listening.
Yeah. Thank you, Charles. This has been such a wonderful conversation.
I agree. Thank you both, Charles and Put. Once again, I appreciate everyone's patience, but more important, buy the book, Ma and Me. You know, we as independent booksellers can't survive without you buying the books, and without the authors writing the books, and without you reading the book. So it's like this all cyclical thing that really means that you need to buy the book. So we have put the purchase link in the chat. If you're here in DC, you can come fetch it, or we can send it to you, but definitely pick it up. It's also really pretty. So there you go.
It is, yeah.
So to both of you, thank you so much for this conversation, and for zooming along with us, and with everyone else who is here, all 23 of you again. Thank you so much, and I wish you a really good Friday of health and well-being, and be nice to your family. All right, take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, y'all. Bye.
Friday. Bye.